This is part 4 of the reading, which contains excerpts from the Psychopathology of Everyday Life by Sigmund Freud, 1901, which is in the public domain. The full text is available freely via Project Gutenberg. Erroneously carried out actions. I shall give another passage from the above-mentioned work of Maringer and Mayer. Lapses in speech do not stand entirely alone. They resemble the errors which often occur in our other activities and are quite foolishly termed a forgetfulness. I am therefore in no way the first to presume that there is sense and purpose behind the slight functional disturbances of the daily life of healthy people. If the lapse in speech, which is without doubt motor function, admits of such conception, it is quite natural to transfer to the lapses of our other motor functions the same expectation. I have here formed two groups of cases. All these cases in which the faulty effect seems to be the essential element. That is, the deviation from the intention. I denote as erroneously carried out actions, vergriffen, the others in which the entire action appears rather inexpedient. I call symptomatic and chance actions, but no distinct line of demarcation can be formed. Indeed, we are forced to conclude that all divisions used in this treatise are of only descriptive significance and contradict the inner unity of the sphere of manifestation. The psychological understanding of erroneous actions apparently gains level and clearness when we place it under the head of ataxia, and especially under cortical ataxia. Let us rather try to trace the individual examples to their proper determinants. To do this I shall again resort to personal observations, the opportunities for which I could not very frequently find in myself. In former years, when I made more calls at the homes of patients than I do at present, it often happened when I stood before a door where I should have knocked or rung the bell that I would pull the key of my own house from my pocket, only to replace it quite abashed. When I investigated in what patients' homes this occurred, I had to admit that the faulty action taking out my key instead of ringing the bell signified paying certain tribute to the house where error occurred. It was equivalent to the thought, "Here I feel at home," as it happened only where I possessed the patient's regard. Naturally, I never rang my own doorbell. The faulty action was therefore symbolic representation of definite thought which was not accepted consciously as serious, and for in reality the neurologist is well aware that the patient seeks him only so long as he expects to be benefited by him, and that his own excessively warm interest for his patient is evinced only as means of psychic treatment. An almost identical repetition of my experiences described by a Meter contrib. A la Psychopathology la vie quotidienne, Arch. Psycho-Romans, 1906. Ieti arrive chac and sorter sun trauso enerven la portan ami particularment share surprender por ainsi dire entrain duver avec sacli camache soy. C'est un retard, puisqu'il faut sonner malgré tout, mais c'est une preuve quan senu quan vauderate sender camache soy, opers set ami. In English, a meter contribution to the Psychopathology of Everyday Life, Arch. Psycho-Romans, 1906. It has happened to everyone to take out their keys upon arriving at the door, particularly, dear friend, to surprise themselves, so to speak, opening the door with their key as if they were at home. It is delay, since they have to ring anyway, but it is proof that they feel or would like to feel at home near this friend. Jones speaks as follows about the use of keys. The use of keys is fertile source of occurrences of this kind, of which two examples may be given. If I am disturbed in the midst of some engrossing work at home by having to go to the hospital to carry out some routine work, I am very apt to find myself trying to open the door of my laboratory there with the key of my desk at home, although the two keys are quite unlike each other. The mistake unconsciously demonstrates where I would rather be at the moment. Some years ago I was acting in subordinate position at a certain institution, front door of which was kept locked, so that it was necessary to ring for admission. On several occasions I found myself making serious attempts to open the door with my house key. Each one of the permanent visiting staff, of which I aspired to be a member, was provided with key to avoid the trouble of having to wait at the door. My mistake thus expressed the desire to be on similar footing and to be quite at home there. A similar experience is reported by Dr. and Sachs of Vienna. I always carry two keys with me, one for the door of my office and one for my residence. They are not by any means easily interchanged, as the office key is at least 3 times as big as my house key. Besides, I carry the first in my trouser pocket and the other in my vest pocket. Yet it often happened that I noticed on reaching the door that while ascending the stairs I had taken out the wrong key. I decided to undertake a statistical examination, as I was daily in about the same emotional state when I stood before both doors. I thought that the interchanging of the two keys must show a regular tendency, if they were differently determined psychically. Observation of later occurrences showed that I regularly took out my house key before the office door. Only on one occasion was this reversed. I came home tired, knowing that I would find there a guest. I made an attempt to unlock the door with the naturally too big office key. At a certain time twice a day for 6 years I was accustomed to wait for admission before a door in the second story of the same house, and during this long period of time it happened twice within a short interval that I climbed a story higher. On the first of these occasions I was in an ambitious daydream, which allowed me to mount always higher and higher. In fact, at that time I heard the door in question open as I put my foot on the first step of the third flight. On the other occasion I again went too far, engrossed in thought. As soon as I became aware of it, I turned back and sought to snatch the dominating fantasy. I found that I was irritated over criticism of my works, in which the reproach was made that I always went too far, which I replaced by the less respectful expression climbed too high. See, for many years a reflex hammer and a tuning fork lay side by side on my desk. One day I hurried off at the close of my office hours, as I wished to catch a certain train, and, despite broad daylight, put the tuning fork in my coat pocket in place of the reflex hammer. My attention was called to the mistake through the weight of the object drawn down my pocket. Any one unaccustomed to reflect on such slight occurrences would without hesitation explain the faulty action by the hurry of the moment, and excuse it. In spite of that, I preferred to ask myself why I took the tuning fork instead of the hammer. The haste could just as well have been a motive for carrying out the action properly in order not to waste time over the correction. Who last grasped the tuning fork was the question which immediately flashed through my mind. It happened that only a few days ago an idiotic child, whose attention to sensory impressions I was testing, had been so fascinated by the tuning fork that I found it difficult to tear it away from him. Could it mean, therefore, that I was an idiot? To be sure, so it would seem, as the next thought which associated itself with the hammer was Cham or Hebrew for ours. But what was the meaning of this abuse of language? We must here inquire into the situation. I hurried to a consultation at a place on the Western Railroad to see a patient who, according to the anamnesis which I received by letter, had fallen from a balcony some months before, and since then had been unable to walk. The physician who invited me wrote that he was still unable to say whether he was dealing with a spinal injury or traumatic neurosis. Hysteria. That was what I was to decide. This could therefore be reminded to be particularly careful. This delicate differential diagnosis, as it is, my colleagues think that hysteria is diagnosed far too carelessly where more serious matters are concerned. But the abuse is not yet justified. Yes, the next association was that the small railroad station is the same place in which, some years previous, I saw a young man who, after a certain emotional experience, could not walk properly. At that time I diagnosed his malady as hysteria, and later put him under psychic treatment, but it afterward turned out that my diagnosis was neither incorrect nor correct. A large number of the patient's symptoms were hysterical, and they promptly disappeared in the course of treatment. But back of these there was visible remnant that could not be reached by therapy and could be referred only to multiple sclerosis. Those who saw the patient after me had no difficulty in recognizing the organic affection. I could scarcely have acted or judged differently. Still the impression was that of serious mistake. The promise of cure which I had given him could naturally not be kept. The mistake in grasping the tuning fork instead of the hammer could therefore be translated into the following words. You fool, you ass, get yourself together this time, and be careful not to diagnose again case of hysteria where there is an incurable disease, as you did in this place years ago. And case of the poor man, and fortunately for this little analysis, even if unfortunately for my mood, this same man, now having very spastic gait, had been to my office a few days before, one day after the examination of the idiotic child. We observe that this time it is the voice of self-criticism which makes itself perceptible through the mistaken grasping. The erroneously carried out action is specially suited to express self-reproach. The present mistake attempts to represent the mistake which was committed elsewhere. It is quite obvious that grasping the wrong thing may also serve a whole series of other obscure purposes. Here is a first example. It is very seldom that I break anything. I am not particularly dexterous, but by virtue of the anatomic integrity of my nervous and muscular apparatus there are apparently no grounds in me for such awkward movements with undesirable results. I can recall no object in my home the counterpart of which I have ever broken. Owing to the narrowness of my study, it has often been necessary for me to work in the most uncomfortable position among my numerous antique clay and stone objects, of which I have a small collection. So much is this true that onlookers have expressed fear lest I topple down something and shatter, but it never happened. Then why did I brush to the floor the cover of my simple inkwell so that it broke into pieces? My inkstand is made of a flat piece of marble which is hollowed out for the reception of the glass inkwell. The inkwell has a marble cover with a knob of the same stone. A circle of bronze statuettes with small terracotta figures is set behind this inkstand. I seated myself at the desk to write. I made a remarkably awkward outward movement with the hand holding the pen holder and so swept the cover of the inkstand which already lay on the desk to the floor. It is not difficult to find the explanation. Some hours before my sister had been in the room to look at some of my new acquisitions. She found them very pretty and then remarked, "Now the desk really looks very well, only the inkstand does not match. You must get a prettier one." I accompanied my sister out and did not return for several hours. But then, as it seems, I performed the execution of the condemned inkstand. Yet I perhaps conclude from my sister's words that she intended to present me with prettier inkstand on the next festive occasion, and did I shatter the unsightly old one in order to force her to carry out her signified intention. If that be so, then my swinging motion was only apparently awkward. In reality it was most skillful in design, as it understood how to avoid all the valuable objects located near. I actually believe that we must accept this explanation for a whole series of seemingly accidental awkward movements. It is true that on the surface these seem to show something violent and irregular, similar to spastic ataxic movements, but on examination they seem to be dominated by some intention, and they accomplish their aim with certainty that cannot be generally credited to conscious arbitrary motions. In both characteristics, the force as well as a sure aim. They show besides resemblance to the motor manifestations of the hysterical neurosis, and in part also to the motor accomplishments of somnambulism, which here as well as there point to the same unfamiliar modification of the functions of innervation. In latter years, since I have been collecting such observations, it has happened several times that I have shattered and broken objects of some value, but the examination of these cases convinced me that it was never the result of accident or my unintentional awkwardness. Thus, one morning while in my bathrobe and straw slippers I followed sudden impulse as I passed room, and hurled slipper from my foot against the wall so that it brought down beautiful little marble Venus from its bracket. As it fell to pieces I recited quite unmoved the following verse from Bush, which Die Venus is per declicoratums von Medici. This crazy action and my calmness at the sight of the damage is explained in the then existing situation. We had a very sick person in the family, of whose recovery I had personally despaired. That morning I had been informed that there was a great improvement. I know that I had said to myself, after all she will live. My attack of destructive madness served therefore as the expression of grateful feeling toward fate, and afforded me the opportunity of performing an act of sacrifice, just as if I had vowed, if she gets well I will give this or that as sacrifice. That I chose the Venus of Medici as this sacrifice was only gallant homage to the convalescent. But even today it is still incomprehensible to me that I decided so quickly, aimed so accurately, and struck no other object in close proximity. Another breaking, in which I utilized penholder falling from my hand, also signified sacrifice. But this time it was pious offering to avert some evil. I had once allowed myself to reproach true and worthy friend for no other reason than certain manifestations which I interpreted from his unconscious activity. He took it amiss and wrote me a letter in which he bade me not to treat my friends by psychoanalysis. I had to admit that he was right, and appease him with my answer. While writing this letter I had before me my latest acquisition. Small, handsome, glazed Egyptian figure. I broke it in the manner mentioned, and then immediately knew that I had caused this mischief to avert greater one. Luckily, both the friendship and the figure could be so cemented that the break would not be noticed. A third case of breaking had a less serious connection. It was only a disguised execution, to use an expression from Th. Fischer's Ausscheiner, of an object that no longer suited my taste. For quite while I had carried king with silver handle, through no fault of mine the thin silver plate was once damaged and poorly repaired. Soon after the cane was returned I mirthfully used the handle to angle for the leg of one of my children. In that way it naturally broke, and I got rid of it. The indifference with which we accept the resulting damage in all these cases may certainly be taken as evidence for the existence of an unconscious purpose in their execution, as can sometimes be demonstrated by analysis. The dropping of objects or the overturning and breaking of the same are very frequently utilized as the expression of unconscious streams of thought, but more often they serve to represent the superstitious or odd significances connected therewith in popular sayings. The meanings attached to the spilling of salt, the overturning of wine glass, the sticking of knife dropped to the floor, and so on, are well known. I shall discuss later the right to investigate such superstitious interpretations. Here I shall simply observe that the individual awkward acts do not by any means always have the same meaning, but depending on the circumstances, they serve to represent now this or that purpose. Recently we passed through a period in my house during which an unusual number of glass and china dishes were broken. I myself largely contributed to this damage. This little endemic was readily explained by the fact that it preceded the public betrothal of my eldest daughter. On such festivities it is customary to break some dishes and utter at the same time some felicitating expression. This custom may signify sacrifice or express any other symbolic sense. When servants destroy fragile objects through dropping them, we certainly do not think in the first place of a psychologic motive for it. Still, some obscure motives are not improbable even here. Nothing lies farther from the uneducated than the appreciation of art and works of art. Our servants are dominated by a foolish hostility against these productions, especially when the objects, whose worth they do not realize, become a source of a great deal of work for them. On the other hand, persons of the same education and origin employed in scientific institutions often distinguish themselves by great dexterity and reliability in the handling of delicate objects as soon as they begin to identify themselves with their masters and consider themselves an essential part of the staff. I shall here add the report of a young mechanical engineer, which gives some insight into the mechanism of damaging things. Some time ago, I worked with many others in the laboratory of the high school on a series of complicated experiments on the subject of elasticity. It was work that we undertook of our own volition, but it turned out that it took up more of our time than we expected. One day, while going to the laboratory with F, he complained of losing so much time, especially on this day, when he had so many other things to do at home. I could only agree with him, and he added half-jokingly, alluding to an incident of the previous week, "Let us hope that the machine will refuse to work so that we can interrupt the experiment and go home earlier." In arranging the work, it happened that F was assigned to the regulation of the pressure valve. That is, it was his duty to carefully open the valve and let the fluid under pressure flow from the accumulator into the cylinder of the hydraulic press. The leader of the experiment stood at the manometer and called a loud stop when the maximum pressure was reached. At this command F grasped the valve and turned it with all his force. To the left, all valves, without any exception, are close to the right. This caused sudden full pressure in the accumulator of the press, and as there was no outlet, the connecting pipe burst. This was quite trifling accident to the machine, but enough to force us to stop our work for the day and go home. It is characteristic, moreover, that some time later on, discussing this occurrence, my friend F could not recall the remark that I positively remember his having made. Similarly, to fall, to make misstep, or to slip need not always be interpreted as an entirely accidental miscarriage of motor action. The linguistic double meaning of these expressions points to diverse hidden fantasies, which may present themselves through the giving up of bodily equilibrium. I recall a number of lighter nervous ailments in women and girls which made their appearance after falling without injury, and which were conceived as traumatic hysteria as a result of the shock of the fall. At that time I already entertained the impression that these conditions had different connection, that the fall was already preparation of the neurosis, and an expression of the same unconscious fantasies of sexual content which may be taken as the moving forces behind symptoms. Was not this very thing meant in the proverb which says, "When maiden falls, she falls on her back"? We can also add to these mistakes the case of one who gives beggar gold piece in place of copper or silver coin. The solution of such mishandling is simple. It is an act of sacrifice designed to mollify fate, to avert evil, and so on. If we hear a tender mother or aunt express concern regarding the health of a child directly before taking a walk during which she displays her charity, contrary to her usual habit, we can no longer doubt the sense of this apparently undesirable accident. In this manner our faulty acts make possible the practice of all those pious and superstitious customs which must shun the light of consciousness, because of the strivings against them of our unbelieving reason. F. That accidental actions are really intentional will find no greater credence in any other sphere than in sexual activity, where the border between the intention and accident hardly seems discernible. That an apparently clumsy movement may be utilized in a most refined way for sexual purposes I can verify by a nice example from my own experience. In a friend's house I met a young girl visitor who excited in me a feeling of fondness which I had long believed extinct, thus putting me in jovial, loquacious, and complacent mood. At that time I endeavored to find out how this came about, as a year before this same girl made no impression on me. As the girl's uncle, very old man, entered the room, we both jumped to our feet to bring him a chair which stood in the corner. She was more agile than I, also nearer the object, so that she was the first to take possession of the chair. She carried it with its back to her, holding both hands on the edge of the seat. As I got there later and did not give up the claim to carrying the chair, I suddenly stood directly back of her, and with both my arms was embracing her from behind, and for a moment my hands touched her lap. I naturally solved the situation as quickly as it came about. Or did it occur to anybody how dexterously I had taken advantage of this awkward movement? Occasionally I have had to admit to myself that the annoying, awkward stepping aside on the street, whereby for some seconds one steps here and there, yet always in the same direction as the other person, until finally both stop facing each other, that this, barring one's way, repeats an ill-mannered, provoking conduct of earlier times and conceals erotic purposes under the mask of awkwardness. From my psychoanalysis of neurotics, I know that the so-called naivete of young people and children is frequently only such mask, employed in order that the subject may say or do the indecent without restraint. W. Steckel has reported similar observations in regard to himself. I entered house and offered my right hand to the hostess. In most remarkable way I thereby loosened the bow which held together her loose morning gown. I was conscious of no dishonorable intent, still I executed this awkward movement with the agility of juggler. The effects which result from mistakes of normal persons are, as a rule, of almost harmless nature. Just for this reason it would be particularly interesting to find out whether mistakes of considerable importance, which could be followed by serious results, as for example, those of physicians or druggists, fall within the range of our point of view. As I am seldom in position to deal with active medical matters, I can only report one mistake from my own experience. I treated a very old woman, whom I visited twice daily for several years. My medical activities were limited to 2 acts, which I performed during my morning visits. I dropped a few drops of an eye lotion into her eyes and gave her hypodermic injection of morphine. I prepared regularly 2 bottles, a blue one containing the eye lotion and a white one containing the morphine solution. While performing these duties my thoughts were mostly occupied with something else, for they had been repeated so often that the attention acted as if free. One morning I noticed that the automaton worked wrong. I had put the dropper into the white instead of into the blue bottle, and had dropped into the eyes the morphine instead of the lotion. I was greatly frightened, but then calmed myself through the reflection that a few drops of a 2% solution of morphine would not likely do any harm even if left in the conjunctival sac. The cause of the fright manifestly belonged elsewhere. In attempting to analyze this slight mistake, I first thought of the phrase, "to seize the old woman by mistake," which pointed out the short way to the solution. I had been impressed by a dream which a young man had told me the previous evening, the contents of which could be explained only on the basis of sexual intercourse with his own mother. The strangeness of the fact that the Oedipus legend takes no offense at the age of Queen Jocasta seemed to me to agree with the assumption that in being in love with one's mother we never deal with the present personality, but with her youthful memory picture carried over from our childhood. Such incongruities always show themselves where one fantasy fluctuating between 2 periods is made conscious, and is then bound to one definite period. Deep in thoughts of this kind, I came to my patient of over 90. I must have been well on the way to grasp the universal character of the Oedipus fable as the correlation of the fate which the oracle pronounces, for I made blunder in reference to her on the old woman. Here, again, the mistake was harmless. Of the 2 possible errors, taking the morphine solution for the eye, or the eye lotion for the injection, I chose the one by far the least harmful. The question still remains open whether in mistakes in handling things which may cause serious harm we can assume an unconscious intention, as in the cases here discussed. The following case from Brill's experience corroborates the assumption that even serious mistakes are determined by unconscious intentions. Physician received telegram informing him that his aged uncle was very sick. In spite of important family affairs at home, he at once repaired to that distant town because his uncle was really his father, who had cared for him since he was 1½ years old, when his own father had died. On reaching there, he found his uncle suffering from pneumonia, and as the old man was an octogenarian, the doctors held out no hope for his recovery. It was simply a question of a day or 2, was the local doctor's verdict. Although a prominent physician in our big city, he refused to cooperate in the treatment, as he found that the case was properly managed by the local doctor, and he could not suggest anything to improve matters. Since death was daily expected, he decided to remain to the end. He waited a few days, but the sick man struggled hard, and although there was no question of any recovery, because the many new complications which had arisen, death seemed to be deferred for a while. One night before retiring, he went into the sick room and took his uncle's pulse, as it was quite weak. He decided not to wait for the doctor and administered a hypodermic injection. The patient grew rapidly worse and died within a few hours. There was something strange in the last symptoms, and on later attempting to replace the tube of hypodermic tablets into the case, found to his consternation that he had taken out the wrong tube, and instead of small dose of digitalis, he had given large dose of hyson. This case was related to me by the doctor after he read my paper on the Oedipus complex. We agreed that this mistake was determined not only by his impatience to get home to his sick child, but also by an old resentment and unconscious hostility toward his uncle, father. It is known that in the more serious cases of psychoneurosis, one sometimes finds self-mutilations as symptoms of the disease. That the psychic conflict may end in suicide can never be excluded in these cases. Thus I know from experience, which someday I shall support with convincing examples, that many apparently accidental injuries happening to such patients are really self-inflicted. This is brought about by the fact that there is a constantly lurking tendency to self-punishment, usually expressing itself in self-reproach or contributing to the formation of a symptom which skillfully makes use of an external situation. The required external situation may accidentally present itself, or the punishment tendency may assist it until the way is open for the desired injurious effect. Such occurrences are by no means rare even in cases of moderate severity, and they betray the portion of unconscious intention through a series of special features. For example, through the striking presence of mind which the patients show in the pretended accidents. I will report exhaustively one in place of many such examples from my professional experience. A young woman broke her leg below the knee in carriage accident so that she was bedridden for weeks. The striking part of it was the lack of any manifestation of pain and the calmness with which she bore her misfortune. This calamity ushered in long and serious neurotic illness, from which she was finally cured by psychotherapy. During the treatment I discovered circumstances surrounding the accident, as well as certain impressions which preceded it. The young woman with her jealous husband spent some time on the farm of her married sister, in company with her numerous other brothers and sisters with their wives and husbands. One evening she gave an exhibition of one of her talents before this intimate circle. She danced artistically the cancan to the great delight of her relatives, but to the great annoyance of her husband, who afterward whispered to her, "Again you have behaved like prostitute." The words took effect. We'll leave it undecided whether it was just on account of the dance. That night she was restless in her sleep, and the next forenoon she decided to go out driving. She chose the horses herself, refusing one team and demanding another. Her youngest sister wished to have her baby with its nurse accompany her, but she opposed this vehemently. During the drive she was nervous. She reminded the coachman that the horses were getting skittish, and as the fidgety animals really produced momentary difficulty, she jumped from the carriage in fright and broke her leg, while those remaining in the carriage were uninjured. Although after the disclosure of these details we can hardly doubt that this accident was really contrived, we cannot fail to admire the skill which forced the accident to mete out punishment so suitable to the crime. For as it happened, cancan dancing with her became impossible for a long time. Concerning self-inflicted injuries, though, my own experience, I cannot report anything in calm times, but under extraordinary conditions I do not believe myself incapable of such acts. When a member of my family complains that he or she has bitten his tongue, bruised her finger, and so on, instead of the expected sympathy, I put the question, "Why did you do that?" But I have most painfully squeezed my thumb after. A youthful patient acquainted me during the treatment with his intention, naturally not to be taken seriously, of marrying my eldest daughter, while I knew that she was then in a private hospital in extreme danger of losing her life. One of my boys, whose vivacious temperament was one to put difficulties in the management of nursing him in his illness, had a fit of anger one morning because he was ordered to remain in bed during the forenoon and threatened to kill himself, a way out suggested to him by the newspapers. In the evening he showed me a swelling on the side of his chest which was the result of bumping against the doorknob. To my ironical question why he did it, and what he meant by it, the 11-year-old child explained, "That was my attempt at suicide which I threatened this morning. However, I do not believe that my views on self-inflicted ones were accessible to my children at that time." Whoever believes in the occurrence of semi-intentional self-inflicted injury, if this awkward expression be permitted, will become prepared to accept through it the fact that aside from conscious intentional suicide there also exists semi-intentional annihilation, with unconscious intention, which is capable of aptly utilizing threat against life and masking it as casual mishap. Such mechanism is by no means rare. For tendency to self-destruction exists to a certain degree in many more persons than in those who bring it to completion. Self-inflicted injuries are, as a rule, compromised between this impulse and the forces working against it, and even where it really comes to suicide the inclination has existed for a long time with less strength or as an unconscious and repressed tendency. Even suicide consciously committed chooses its time, means, and opportunity. It is quite natural that unconscious suicide should wait for a motive to take upon itself one part of the causation and thus free it from its oppression by taking up the defensive forces of the person. These are in no way idle discussions which I here bring up. On more than one case of apparently accidental misfortune on a horse or out of a carriage has become known to me whose surrounding circumstances justified the suspicion of suicide. For example, during an officer's horse race, one of the riders fell from his horse and was so seriously injured that a few days later he succumbed to his injuries. His behavior after regaining consciousness was remarkable in more than one way, and his conduct previous to the accident was still more remarkable. He had been greatly depressed by the death of his beloved mother, had crying spells in the society of his comrades, and to his trusted friend had spoken of the tedium vitae. He had wished to quit the service in order to take part in war in Africa, which had no interest for him. Formerly keen rider, he had later evaded riding whenever possible. Finally, before the horse race, from which he could not withdraw, he expressed sad foreboding, which most expectedly in the light of our conception came true. It may be contended that it is quite comprehensible, without any further cause, that person in such state of nervous depression cannot manage horse as well as on normal days. I quite agree with that, only I should like to look for the mechanism of this motor inhibition through nervousness in the intention of self-destruction here emphasized. Dr. Ferenczi has left to me for publication the analysis of an apparently accidental injury by shooting which he explained as an unconscious attempt at suicide. I can only agree with his deduction. J. 22 years old, carpenter, visited me on the 18th of January, 1908. He wished to know whether the bullet which pierced his left temple March 20, 1907 could or should be removed by operation. Aside from occasional, not very severe, headaches, he felt quite well. Also, the objective examination showed nothing besides the characteristic powder wound on the left temple, so that I advised against an operation. When questioned concerning the circumstances of the case, he asserted that he injured himself accidentally. He was playing with his brother's revolver, and believing that it was not loaded, he pressed it with his left hand against the left temple. He is not left-handed, put his finger on the trigger, and the shot went off. There were 3 bullets in the 6-shooter. I asked him how he came to carry the revolver, and he answered that it was at the time of his army conscription, that he took it in the evening before because he feared fights. At the army examination he was considered unfit for service on account of varicose veins, which caused him much mortification. He went home and played with the revolver. He had no intention of hurting himself, but the accident occurred. On further questioning whether he was otherwise satisfied with his fortune, he answered with a sigh, and related love affair with a girl who loved him in return, but nevertheless left him. She emigrated to America out of sheer avariciousness. He wanted to follow her, but his parents prevented him. His lady love left on the 20th of January, 1907, just 2 months before the accident. Despite all these suspicious elements, the patient insisted that the shot was an accident. I was firmly convinced, however, that the neglect to find out whether the revolver was loaded before he began to play with it, as well as the self-inflicted injury, were psychically determined. He was still under the depressing effects of the unhappy love affair, and apparently wanted to forget everything in the army. When this hope, too, was taken away from him, he resorted to playing with the weapon. That is, to an unconscious attempt at suicide. The fact that he did not hold the revolver in the right but in the left hand speaks conclusively in favor of the fact that he was really only playing, that is, he did not wish consciously to commit suicide. Another analysis of an apparently accidental self-inflicted wound detailed to me by an observer recalls the saying, "He who digs pit for others falls in himself." Mrs. X, belonging to good middle-class family, is married and has 3 children. She is somewhat nervous, but never needed any strenuous treatment, as she could sufficiently adapt herself to life. One day she sustained rather striking though transitory disfigurement of her face in the following manner. She stumbled in the street that was in process of repair and struck her face against the house wall. The whole face was bruised, the eyelids blue and edematous, and as she feared that something might happen to her eyes, she sent for the doctor. After she was calmed, I asked her, "But why did you fall in such manner?" She answered that just before this accident she warned her husband, who had been suffering for some months from joint affection, to be very careful in the street, and she often had the experience that in some remarkable way those things occurred to her against which she warned others. I was not satisfied with this as the determination of her accident, and asked her whether she had not something else to tell me. Just before the accident she noticed a nice picture in shop on the other side of the street, which she suddenly desired as an ornament for her nursery, and wished to buy it at once. She thereupon walked across to the shop without looking at the street, stumbled over a heap of stones, and fell with her face against the wall without making the slightest effort to shield herself with her hands. The intention to buy the picture was immediately forgotten, and she walked home in haste. "But why were you not more careful?" I asked. Well, she answered, perhaps it was only punishment for that episode which I confided to you. Does this episode still bother you? 5 years later, I regretted it very much. I considered myself wicked, criminal, and immoral, but at the time I was almost crazy with nervousness. She referred to an abortion which was started by Quack and had to be brought to completion by gynecologist. This abortion was initiated with the consent of her husband, as both wished, on account of their pecuniary circumstances, to be spared from being additionally blessed with children. She said, I had often reproached myself with the words, "You really had your child killed, and I feared that such crime could not remain unpunished. Now that you have assured me that there is nothing seriously wrong with my eyes, I am quite assured I have already been sufficiently punished. This accident, therefore, was, on the one hand, retribution for her sin, but on the other hand, it may have served as an escape from more dire punishment which she had feared for many months." In the moment that she ran to the shop to buy the picture, the memory of this whole history, with its fears, already quite active in her unconscious at the time she warned her husband, became overwhelming and could perhaps find expression in words like these. But why do you want an ornament for the nursery? You who had your child killed, you're a murderer. The great punishment is surely approaching. This thought did not become conscious, but instead of it she made use of the situation, might say of the psychologic moment, to utilize in commonplace manner the heap of stones to inflict upon herself this punishment. It was for this reason that she did not even attempt to put out her arms while falling and was not much frightened. The second, and probably lesser, determinant of her accident was obviously self-punishment for her unconscious wish to be rid of her husband, who was an accessory to the crime in this affair. This was betrayed by her absolutely superfluous warning to be very careful in the street on account of the stones. For, just because her husband had weak leg, he was very careful in walking. If such rage against one's own integrity and one's own life can be hidden behind apparently accidental awkwardness and motor insufficiency, then it is not big. Step forward to grasp the possibility of transferring the same conception to mistakes which seriously endanger the life and health of others. What I can put forward as evidence for the validity of this conception was taken from my experience with neurotics, and hence does not fully meet the demands of this situation. I will report a case in which it was not an erroneously carried out action, but what may be more aptly termed symbolic or chance action that gave me the clue which later made possible the solution of the patient's conflict. I once undertook to improve the marriage relations of a very intelligent man, whose differences with his tenderly attached young wife could surely be traced to real causes, but as he himself admitted could not be altogether explained through them. He continually occupied himself with the thought of a separation, which he repeatedly rejected because he dearly loved his 2 small children. In spite of this, he always returned to that resolution and sought no means to make the situation bearable to himself. Such an unsettlement of a conflict served to prove to me that there were unconscious and repressed motives which enforced the conflicting conscious thoughts, and in such cases I always undertake to end the conflict by psychic analysis. One day the man related to me a slight occurrence which had extremely frightened him. He was sporting with the older child, by far his favorite. He tossed it high in the air and repeated it, tossing till finally he thrust it so high that its head almost struck the massive gas chandelier, almost, but not quite, Crusade, just about. Nothing happened to the child except that it became dizzy from fright. The father stood transfixed with the child in his arms, while the mother merged into an hysterical attack. The particular facility of this careless movement, with the violent reaction in the parents, suggested to me to look upon this accident as symbolic action which gave expression to an evil intention toward the beloved child. I could remove the contradiction of the actual tenderness of this father for his child by referring the impulse to injure it to the time when it was the only one, and so small that as yet the father had no occasion for tender interest in it. Then it was easy to assume that this man, so little pleased with his wife at that time, might have thought, if this small being for whom I have no regard whatever should die, I would be free and could separate from my wife. The wish for the death of this much-loved being must therefore have continued unconsciously. From here it was easy to find the way to the unconscious fixation of this wish. There was indeed powerful determinant in memory from the patient's childhood. It referred to the death of little brother, which the mother laid to his father's negligence, and which led to serious quarrels with threats of separation between the parents. The continued course of my patient's life, as well as the therapeutic success, confirmed my analysis. Chapter 9. Symptomatic and chance actions. The actions described so far, in which we recognize the execution of an unconscious intention, appeared as disturbances of other unintended actions, and hid themselves under the pretext of awkwardness. Chance actions, which we shall now discuss, differ from erroneously carried out actions only in that they disdain the support of a conscious intention and really need no pretext. They appear independently and are accepted because 1. does not credit them with any aim or purpose. We execute them, without thinking anything of them, by mere chance, or just to keep the hands busy, and we feel confident that such information will be quite sufficient should one inquire as to their significance. In order to enjoy the advantage of this exceptional position, these actions which no longer claim awkwardness as an excuse must fulfill certain conditions. They must not be striking, and their effects must be insignificant. I have collected large number of such chance actions from myself and others, and after thoroughly investigating the individual examples, I believe that the name symptomatic actions is more suitable. They give expression to something which the actor himself does not suspect in them, and which as a rule he has no intention of imparting to others, but aims to keep to himself. Like the other phenomena considered so far, they thus play the part of symptoms. The richest output of such chance or symptomatic actions is above all obtained in the psychoanalytic treatment of neurotics. I cannot deny myself the pleasure of showing by two examples of this nature how far and how delicately the determination of these plain occurrences are swayed by unconscious thoughts. The line of demarcation between the symptomatic actions and the erroneously carried out actions is so indefinite that I could have disposed of these examples in the preceding chapter. During the analysis, a young woman reproduced this idea which suddenly occurred to her. Yesterday, while cutting her nails, she had cut into the flesh while engaged in trimming the cuticle. This is of so little interest that we ask in astonishment why it is at all remembered and mentioned, and therefore come to the conclusion that we deal with symptomatic action. It was really the finger upon which the wedding ring is worn which was injured through this slight awkwardness. Happened, moreover, on her wedding day, which thus gives to the injury of the delicate skin very definite and easily guessed meaning. At the same time she also related dream which alluded to the awkwardness of her husband and her anesthesia as woman. But why did she injure the ring finger of her left hand when the wedding ring is worn on the ring? Her husband is jurist, doctor of laws, Dr. Derrich, literally doctor of rights, and her secret affection as girl belonged to physician who is jokingly called Dr. Derlink, literally doctor of left. Incidentally, left-handed marriage has definite meaning. B. Single young woman relates, yesterday, quite unintentionally, I tore a $100 note in two pieces and gave half to woman who was visiting me. Is that too a symptomatic action? After closer investigation, the matter of the $100 note elicited the following associations. She dedicated part of her time and her fortune to charitable work. Together with another woman, she was taking care of the rearing of an orphan. The $100 was the contribution sent her by that woman, which she enclosed in an envelope and provisionally deposited on her writing desk. The visitor was a prominent woman with whom she was associated in another act of charity. This woman wished to note the names of a number of persons to whom she could apply for charitable aid. There was no paper, so my patient grasped the envelope from her desk and, without thinking of its contents, tore it in two pieces, one of which she kept, in order to have duplicate listed names, and gave the other to her visitor. Note the harmlessness of this aimless occurrence. It is known that $100 note suffers no loss in value when it is torn, provided all the pieces are produced. That the woman would not throw away the piece of paper was assumed by the importance of the names on it, and there was just as little doubt that she would return the valuable content as soon as she noticed it. But to what unconscious thought should this chance action, which was made possible through forgetfulness, give expression? The visitor in this case had very definite relation to my patient and myself. It was she who at one time had recommended me as physician to the suffering girl, and if I am not mistaken, my patient considered herself indebted for this advice. Should this $100 note perhaps represent fee for her mediation? That still remained enigmatic, but other material was added to this beginning. Several days before, a woman mediator of a different sort had inquired of a relative whether the gracious young lady wished to make the acquaintance of a certain gentleman, and that morning, some hours before the woman's visit, the wooden letter of the suitor arrived, giving occasion for much mirth. When therefore the visitor opened the conversation with inquiries regarding the health of my patient, the latter could well have thought, "You certainly found me the right doctor, but if you could assist me in obtaining the right husband and child, I should be still more grateful." Both mediators became fused into one in this repressed thought, and she handed the visitor the fee which her fantasy was ready to give the other. This resolution became perfectly convincing when I add that I had told her of such chance or symptomatic actions only the previous evening. She then took advantage of the next occasion to produce an analogous action. We can undertake grouping of these extremely frequent chance and symptomatic actions according to their occurrence as habitual, regular under certain circumstances, and as isolated ones. The first group, such as playing with the watch chain, fingering one's beard, and so on, which can almost serve as characteristic of the person concerned, is related to the numerous tic movements, and certainly deserves to be dealt with in connection with the latter. In the second group I place the playing with one's cane, the scribbling with one's pencil, the jingling of coins in one's pocket, kneading dough and other plastic materials, all sorts of handling of one's clothing, and many other actions of the same order. These playful occupations during psychic treatment regularly conceal sense and meaning to which other expression is denied. Generally, the person in question knows nothing about it. He is unaware whether he is doing the same thing or whether he has imitated certain modifications in his customary playing, and he also fails to see or hear the effects of these actions. For example, he does not hear the noise which is produced by the jingling of coins, and he, astonished and incredulous when his attention is called to it, of equal significance to the physician, and worthy of his observation, is everything that one does with his clothing often without noticing. Every change in the customary attire, every little negligence, such as an unfastened button, every trace of exposure means to express something that the wearer of the apparel does not wish to say directly. Usually he is entirely unconscious of it. The interpretation of these trifling chance actions, as well as the proof for their interpretation, can be demonstrated every time with sufficient certainty from the surrounding circumstances during the treatment, from the themes on discussion, and from the ideas that come to the surface when attention is directed to the seeming accident. Because of this connection, I will refrain from supporting my assertions by reporting examples with their analyses, but I mention these matters because I believe that they have the same meaning in normal persons as in my patients. I cannot, however, refrain from showing by at least one example how closely an habitually accomplished symbolic action may be connected with the most intimate and important part of the life of a normal individual, as Professor Freud has taught us, the symbolism in the infantile life of the normal plays a greater role than was expected from earlier psychoanalytic experiences. In view of this, the following brief analysis may be of general interest, especially on account of its medical aspects. A doctor, on rearranging his furniture in a new house, came across a straight, wooden stethoscope, and, after pausing to decide where he should put it, was impelled to place it on the side of his writing desk in such a position that it stood exactly between his chair and the one reserved for his patients. The act in itself was certainly odd, for in the first place the straight stethoscope served no purpose, as he invariably used a binaural one, and in the second place, all his medical apparatus and instruments were always kept in drawers, with the sole exception of this one. However, he gave no thought to the matter until one day it was brought to his notice by a patient who had never seen a wooden stethoscope, asking him what it was. On being told, she asked why he kept it there. He answered in an offhand way that place was as good as any other. This, however, started him thinking, and he wondered whether there had been an unconscious motive in his action. Being interested in the psychoanalytic method, he asked me to investigate the matter. The first memory that occurred to him was the fact that when medical student he had been struck by the habit his hospital intern had of always carrying in his hand wooden stethoscope on his ward visits, although he never used it. He greatly admired this intern and was much attached to him. Later on, when he himself became an intern, he contracted the same habit, and would feel very uncomfortable if by mistake he left the room without having the instrument to swing in his hand. The aimlessness of the habit was shown not only by the fact that the only stethoscope he ever used was a binaural one, which he carried in his pocket, but also in that it was continued when he was surgical intern and never needed any stethoscope at all. From this it was evident that the idea of the instrument in question had in some way or other become invested with a greater psychic significance than normally belongs to it. In other words, that to the subject it stood for more than it does for other people. The idea must have got unconsciously associated with some other one which it symbolized, and from which it derived its additional fullness of meaning. I will forestall the rest of the analysis by saying what this secondary idea was. Namely, phallic one, the way in which this curious association had been formed will presently be related. The discomfort he experienced in hospital on missing the instrument, and the relief and assurance the presence of it gave him, was related to what is known as castration complex, namely, childhood fear, often continued in disguised form into adult life, less private part of it. Body should be taken away from him, just as playthings so often were. The fear was due to paternal threats that it would be cut off if he were not good boy, particularly in certain direction. This is very common complex, and accounts for a great deal of general nervousness and lack of confidence in later years. Then came a number of childhood memories relating to his family doctor. He had been strongly attached to this doctor as child, and during the analysis long-bearing memories were recovered of double fantasy he had in his 4th year concerning the birth of younger sister, namely, that she was the child, one, of himself and his mother, the father being relegated to the background, and 2, of the doctor and himself. In this he thus played both masculine and feminine part. At the time, when his curiosity was being aroused by the event, he could not help noticing the prominent share taken by the doctor in the proceedings, and sport in a position occupied by the father. The significance of this for his later life will presently be pointed out. The stethoscope association was formed through many connections. In the first place, the physical appearance of the instrument. Straight, rigid, hollow tube, having small bulbous summit at one extremity and broad base at the other, and the fact of its being the essential part of the medical paraphernalia. The instrument with which the doctor performed his magical and interesting feats were matters that attracted his boyish attention. He had had his chest repeatedly examined by the doctor at the age of 6, and distinctly recollected the voluptuous sensation of feeling the latter's head near him pressing the wooden stethoscope into his chest, and of the rhythmic respiratory movement. He had been struck by the doctor's habit of carrying his stethoscope inside his hat. He found it interesting that the doctor should carry his chief instrument concealed about his person, always handy when he went to see patients, and that he only had to take off his hat, part of his clothing, and pull it out. At the age of 8, he was impressed by being told by an older boy that it was the doctor's custom to get into bed with his women patients. It is certain that the doctor, who was young and handsome, was extremely popular among the women of the neighborhood, including the subject's own mother. The doctor and his instrument were therefore the objects of great interest throughout his boyhood. It is probable that, as in many other cases, unconscious identification with the family doctor had been main motive in determining the subject's choice of profession. It was here doubly conditioned, 1. by the superiority of the doctor on certain interesting occasions to the father, of whom the subject was very jealous, and 2. by the doctor's knowledge of forbidden topics and his opportunity for illicit indulgence. The subject admitted that he had on several occasions experienced erotic temptations in regard to his women patients. He had twice fallen in love with one, and finally had married one. The next memory was a dream, plainly of homosexual masochistic nature. In it a man, who proved to be a replacement figure of the family doctor, attacked the subject with sword. The idea of sword, as is so frequently the case in dreams, represented the same idea that was mentioned above to be associated with that of wooden stethoscope. The thought of a sword reminded the subject of the passage in the Nibelung Saga, where Sigurd sleeps with his naked sword, Graham, between him and Brunhilde, an incident that had always greatly struck his imagination. The meaning of the symptomatic act now at last became clear. The subject had placed his wooden stethoscope between him and his patients, just as Sigurd had placed his sword, an equivalent symbol, between him and the maiden he was not to touch. The act was compromise formation. It served both to gratify in his imagination the repressed wish to enter into nearer relations with an attractive patient, interposition of phallus, and at the same time to remind him that this wish was not to become reality, interposition of sword. It was, so to speak, a charm against yielding to temptation. I might add that the following passage from Lord Lytton's Richelieu made great impression on the boy. Beneath the rule of men entirely great, the pen is mightier than the sword. And that he became a prolific writer and uses an unusually large fountain pen. When I asked him what need he had of this pen, he replied in a characteristic manner, "I have so much to express." This analysis again reminds us of the profound views that are afforded us in the psychic life through the harmless and senseless actions, and how early in life the tendency to symbolization develops. I can also relate an experience from my psychotherapeutic practice in which the hand, playing with massive breadcrumbs, gave evidence of an eloquent declaration. My patient was a boy not yet 13 years of age, who had been very hysterical for 2 years. I finally took him for psychoanalytic treatment after a lengthy stay at hydrotherapeutic institution had proved futile. My supposition was that he must have had sexual experiences, and that, corresponding to his age, he had been troubled by sexual questions, but I was cautious about helping him with explanations, as I wished to test further my assumption. I was therefore curious as to the manner in which the desired material would evince itself in him. One day it struck me that he was rolling something between the fingers of his right hand. He would thrust it into his pocket, and there continue playing with it, then would draw it out again, and so on. I did not ask what he had in his hand, but as he suddenly opened his hand he showed it to me. It was breadcrumbs kneaded into mass. At the next session he again brought along mass, and in the course of our conversation, although his eyes were closed, modeled figure with an incredible rapidity which excited my interest. Without doubt it was mannequin like the crudest prehistoric idols, with head, 2 arms, 2 legs, and an appendage between the legs which he drew. At the long point. This was scarcely completed when he kneaded the mannequin together again. Later he allowed it to remain, but modeled an identical appendage on the flat of the back and on other parts in order to veil the meaning of the first. I wished to show him that I had understood him, but at the same time I wanted to deprive him of the evasion that he had thought of nothing while actively forming these figures. With this intention, I suddenly asked him whether he remembered the story of the Roman king who gave his son's envoy pantomimic answer in his garden. The boy did not wish to recall what he must have learned so much more recently than I. He asked if that was the story of the slave on whose bald skull. The answer was written. I told him, no, that belonged to Greek history, and related the following. King Tarquinius Superbus had induced his son Sextus to steal into Latin city. The son, who had later obtained foothold in the city, sent messenger to the king asking what steps he should take next. The king gave no answer, but went into his garden, had the question repeated there, and silently struck off the heads of the largest and most beautiful papas. All that the messenger could do was to report this to Sextus, who understood his father, and caused the most distinguished citizens of the city to be removed by assassination. While I was speaking, the boy stopped kneading, and as I was relating what the king did in his garden, I noticed that at the words, silently struck, he tore off the head of the mannequin with movement as quick as lightning. He therefore understood me, and showed that he was also understood by me. Now, I questioned him directly, and gave him the information that he desired, and in short time the neurosis came to an end. The symptomatic actions which we observe in inexhaustible abundance in healthy as well as in nervous people are worthy of our interest for more than one reason. To the physician they often serve as valuable indications for orienting himself in new or unfamiliar conditions. To the keen observer they often betray everything, occasionally even more than he cares to know. He who is familiar with its application sometimes feels like King Solomon, who, according to Oriental legend, understood the language of animals. One day I was to examine a strange young man at his mother's home. As he came towards me I was attracted by a large stain on his trousers, which by its peculiar stiff edges I recognized as one produced by albumen. After a moment's embarrassment the young man excused the stain by remarking that he was hoarse and therefore drank raw egg, and that some of the slippery white of the egg had probably fallen on his clothes. To confirm his statements he showed the eggshell which could still be seen on a small plate in the room. The suspicious spot was thus explained in this harmless way, but as his mother left us alone I thanked him for having so greatly facilitated the diagnosis for me. And without further procedure I took as the topic of our discussion his confession that he was suffering from the effects of masturbation. Another time I called on a woman as rich as she was miserly and foolish, who was in the habit of giving the physician the task of working his way through a heap of her complaints before he could reach the simple cause of her condition. As I entered she was sitting at a small table engaged in arranging silver dollars in little piles. As she rose she tumbled some of the pieces of money to the floor. I helped her pick them up, but interrupted the recitation of her misery by remarking, "Has your good son-in-law been spending so much of your money again?" She bitterly denied this, only to relate, few moments later, the lamentable story of the aggravation caused by her son-in-law's extravagances, and she has not sent for me since. I cannot maintain that one always makes friends of those to whom he tells the meaning of their symptomatic actions. He who observes his fellow men while at table will be able to verify in them the nicest and most instructive symptomatic actions. Dr. Hans Sachs relates the following. I happened to be present when an elderly couple related to me partook of their supper. The lady had stomach trouble and was forced to follow a strict diet. Roast was put before the husband, and he requested his wife, who was not allowed to partake of this food, to give him the mustard. The wife opened the closet and took out the small bottle of stomach drops and placed it on the table before her husband, between the barrel-shaped mustard glass and the small drop bottle. There was naturally no similarity through which the mishandling could be explained. Yet the wife only noticed the mistake after her husband laughingly called her attention to it. The sense of this symptomatic action needs no explanation. For an excellent example of this kind, which was very skillfully utilized by the observer, I am indebted to Dr. Bern, Detner of Vienna. I dined in a restaurant with my colleague H., doctor of philosophy. He spoke about the injustice done to probationary students, and added that even before he finished his studies he was placed as secretary to the ambassador, or rather the extraordinary plenipotentiary minister to Chile. But he added, the minister was afterwards transferred, and I did not make any effort to meet the newly appointed. While uttering the last sentence he was lifting a piece of pie to his mouth, but he let it drop as if out of awkwardness. I immediately grasped the hidden sense of this symptomatic action, and remarked to my colleague, who was unacquainted with psychoanalysis, "You really allowed very choice morsel to slip from you." He did not realize, however, that my words could equally refer to his symptomatic action, and he repeated the same words I uttered with peculiarly agreeable and surprising vividness, as if I had actually taken the words from his mouth. It was really very choice morsel that I allowed to get away from me. He then followed this remark with detailed description of his clumsiness, which has cost him this very remunerative position. The sense of this symbolic action becomes clearer if we remember that my colleague had scruples about telling me, almost perfect stranger, concerning his precarious material situation, and his repressed thought took on the mask of symptomatic action which expressed symbolically what was meant to be concealed, and Beaker thus got relief from his unconscious. That the taking away or taking along things without any apparent intention may prove to be sensible may be shown by the following examples. Dr. B. Thadner relates, an acquaintance paid the first after-marriage visit to highly regarded lady friend of his youth. He told me of this visit and expressed his surprise at the fact that he failed in his resolution to visit with her only short time, and then reported to me a rather strange faulty act which happened to him there. The husband of this friend, who took part in the conversation, was looking for a box of matches which he was sure was on the table when he came there. My acquaintance, too, looked through his pockets to ascertain whether he had not put it in his pocket, but without avail. Some time later he actually found it in his pocket, and was struck by the fact that there was only one match in the box. Adrima, a few days later, showing the box symbolism in reference to the friend of his youth, confirmed my explanation. With the symptomatic action, my acquaintance meant to announce his priority right and the exclusiveness of his possession. It contained only one match. Dr. Anne Sachs relates the following. Our cook is very fond of certain kind of pie. There is no possible doubt about this, as it is the only kind of pastry which she always prepares well. One Sunday she brought this pie to the table, took it off the pie plate, and proceeded to remove the dishes used in the former course, but on the top of this pie she placed the pie and disappeared with it into the kitchen. We first thought that she had something to improve on the pie, but as she failed to appear, my wife rang the bell and asked Betty what happened to the pie, to which the girl answered, without comprehending the question, "How's that?" We had to call her attention to the fact that she carried the pie back to the kitchen. She had put it on the pile of dishes, taken it out, and put it away without noticing it. The next day, when we were about to consume the rest of the pie, my wife noticed that there was as much of it as we had left the day before. That is, the girl had disdained to eat the portion of her favorite dish which was rightly hers. Questioned why she did not eat the pie, she answered, somewhat embarrassed, that she did not care for it. The infantile attitude is distinctly noticeable on both occasions. First, the childish insatiableness in refusing to share with anybody the object of her wishes, then the reaction of spite which is just as childish. If you grudge it to me, keep it for yourself. I want nothing of it. Chance or symptomatic actions occurring in affairs of married life have often a most serious significance and could lead those who do not concern themselves with the psychology of the unconscious to a belief in omens. It is not an auspicious beginning if a young woman loses her wedding ring on her wedding tour, even if it were only mislaid and soon found. I know a woman, now divorced, who in the management of her business affairs frequently signed her maiden name many years before she actually resumed it. Once I was the guest of a newly married couple and heard the young woman laughingly relate her latest experience, how, on the day succeeding her return from the wedding tour, she had sought out her single sister in order to go shopping with her as in former times, while her husband was attending business. Suddenly she noticed a man on the opposite side of the street, and nudging her sister, she said, "Why, that is surely Estrell." She forgot that for some weeks this man had been her husband. I was chilled at this tale, but I did not dare draw any inferences. The little story came back to me only several years later, after this marriage had ended most unhappily. The following observation, which could as well have found place among the examples of forgetting, was taken from noteworthy work published in French by a Meter. Uni dame nous racontait récemment qu'elle avait oublié sa robe noce et s'en souvint la veille du mariage, et huitière du soir, la cauderie désespérée voir sa client. See details of it et montre que la fiancée ne sentait pas très heureuse porter une robe de base. Elle cherchait et oublier cette représentation pénible. Et elle y était aujourd'hui. Divorcee. In English, a lady recently told us that she forgot to try on her wedding dress and remembered the night before the wedding. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the seamstress was desperate to see her client. This detail is enough to show that the bride did not feel very happy about wearing a wife's dress as she was trying to forget this painful situation. She is now divorced. Friend who has learned to observe signs related to me that the great actress Eleanor Duse introduces symptomatic action into one of her roles, which shows very nicely from what depth she draws her acting. It is drama dealing with adultery. She has just been discussing with her husband and now stands soliloquizing before the seducer makes his appearance. During the short interval she plays with her wedding ring. She pulls it off, replaces it, and finally takes it off again. She is now ready for the other. I know of an elderly man who married a young girl, and instead of starting at once on his wedding tour, he decided to spend the night in a hotel. Scarcely had they reached the hotel when he noticed with fright that he was without his wallet, in which he had the entire sum of money for the wedding tour. He must have mislaid or lost it. He was still able to reach his servant by telephone, and the latter found the missing article in the coat discarded for the traveling clothes and brought to the hotel to the waiting bridegroom, who had thus entered upon his marriage without means. It is consoling to think that the losing of objects by people is merely an unsuspected extension of symptomatic action, and is thus welcome at least to the secret intention of the loser. Often it is only an expression of slight appreciation of the lost article, secret dislike for the same, or perhaps for the person from whom it came, or the desire to lose this object was transferred to it from other and more important objects through symbolic association. The loss of valuable articles serves as an expression of diverse feelings. It may either symbolically represent repressed awe. That is, it may bring back memory which one would rather not hear, or it may represent sacrifice to the obscure forces of fate, the worship of which is not yet entirely extinct even with us. The following examples will illustrate these statements concerning the losing of objects. Dr. B. Thatner states, "A colleague related to me that he lost his steel pencil which he had had for over 2 years, and which, on account of its superior quality, was highly prized by him. Analysis elicited the following facts the day before he had received a very disagreeable letter from his brother-in-law, the concluding sentence of which read, 'At present I have neither the desire nor the time to assist you in your carelessness and laziness.' The effect connected with this letter was so powerful that the next day he promptly sacrificed the pencil which was present from this brother-in-law in order not to be burdened with his favors. Bro report the following example. Doctor took exception to the following statement in my book, We Never Lose What We Really Want, Psychoanalysis, Its Theories, and Practical Application, p. 214. His wife, who is very interested in psychologic subjects, read with him the chapter on Psychopathology of Everyday Life, and they were both very much impressed with the novelty of the ideas, and so on, and were very willing to accept most of the statements. He could not, however, agree with the above given statement because, as he said to his wife, I surely did not wish to lose my knife. He referred to a valuable knife given to him by his wife, which he highly prized, the loss of which caused him much pain. It did not take his wife very long to discover the solution for this loss in manner to convince them both of the accuracy of my statement. When she presented him with this knife, he was a bit loath to accept it. Although he considered himself quite emancipated, he nevertheless entertained some superstition about giving or accepting knife as gift, because it is said that knife cuts friendship. He even remarked this to his wife, who only laughed at his superstition. He had the knife for years, before it disappeared. Analysis brought out the fact that the disappearance of the knife was directly connected with the period when there were violent quarrels between himself and his wife, which threatened to end in separation. They lived happily together until his stepdaughter, it was his second marriage, came to live with them. His daughter was the cause of many misunderstandings, and it was at the height of these quarrels that he lost the knife. The unconscious activity is very nicely shown in the symptomatic action. In spite of his apparent freedom from superstition, he still unconsciously believed that donated knife may cut friendship between the persons concerned. The losing of it was simply an unconscious defense against losing his wife, and by sacrificing the knife he made the superstitious man impotent. In lengthy discussion, and with the aid of dream analysis, Otto Rank made clear the sacrificial tendency with its deep preaching motivation. It must be said that just such symptomatic actions often give us access to the understanding of the intimate psychic life of the person. Of the many isolated chance actions, I will relate one example which showed deeper meaning even without analysis. This example clearly explains the conditions under which such symptoms may be produced most casually, and also shows that an observation of practical importance may be attached to it. During a summer tour, it happened that I had to wait several days at a certain place for the arrival of my traveling companions. In the meantime, I made the acquaintance of a young man who also seemed lonely and was quite willing to join me, as we lived at the same hotel. Quite natural that we should take all our meals and our walks together. On the afternoon of the third day, he suddenly informed me that he expected his wife to arrive on that evening's express train. My psychologic interest was now aroused, as it had already struck me that morning that my companion rejected my proposal to make long excursion, and in our short walk he objected to certain paths as too steep and dangerous. During our afternoon walk, he suddenly thought that I must be hungry, and insisted that I should not delay my evening meal on his account, that he would not sup before his wife's arrival. I understood the hint and seated myself at the table while he went to the station. The next morning we met in the foyer of the hotel. He presented me to his wife and added, "Of course, you will breakfast with us." I had to attend first a small matter in the next street, but assured him that I would return shortly. Later, as I entered the breakfast room, I noticed that the couple were at a small table near the window, both seated on the same side of it. On the opposite side there was only one chair, which was covered, however, with man's large and heavy coat. I understood well the meaning of this unintentional, none the less expressive, disposition of the coat. It meant this: "There is no room for you here. You are superfluous now." The man did not notice that I remained standing before the table, being unable to take the seat, but his wife noticed it, and quickly nudged her husband and whispered, "Why, you have covered the gentleman's place with your coat." These, as well as other similar experiences, have caused me to think that the actions executed unintentionally must inevitably become the source of misunderstanding in human relations. The perpetrator of the act, who is unaware of an associated intention, takes no account of it, and does not hold himself responsible for it. On the other hand, the second party, having regularly utilized even such acts as those of his partner to draw conclusions as to their purpose and meaning, recognizes more of the stranger's psychic processes than the latter is ready either to admit or believe that he has imparted. He becomes indignant when these conclusions drawn from his symptomatic actions are held up, and he declares them baseless because he does not see any conscious intention in their execution, and complains of being misunderstood by the other. Close examination shows that such misunderstandings are based on the fact that the person is too fine an observer and understands too much. The more nervous two persons are, the more readily will they give each other cause for disputes, which are based on the fact that one is definitely denies about his own person what he should accept about the other. And this is, indeed, the punishment for the inner dishonesty to which people grant expression under the guise of forgetting, of erroneous actions and accidental emotions, feeling which they would do better to confess to themselves and others when they can no longer control. As matter of fact, it can be generally affirmed that every one is continually practicing psychoanalysis on his neighbors, and consequently learns to know them better than each individual knows himself. Road following the admonition Nothaisutan leads through the study of one's own apparently casual commissions and omissions. This has been part 4 of Psyched for Psychology's reading of the Psychopathology of Everyday Life by Sigmund Freud, 1901, which is in the public domain. Thanks for listening.